All right, let's jump right in. The title for this explainer, I know, is a bit provocative. Christian Fools. But we're going to be exploring a really fascinating and, yeah, maybe challenging idea from the theologian Arthur Pink. It's all about the danger of what he called lopsided theology, and this idea that biblical truth needs a kind of perfect architectural balance to hold up. Now look, those aren't my words. Those are the words of Jesus Christ himself. And what's so wild about this verse is who he's talking to. This isn't some rant against his enemies. No, he said this on the very day of his resurrection, and he said it to his own disciples, his inner circle. I mean, what a shocking thing to hear from him, right? So that brings us to the big question for this whole thing. Why? I mean, what on earth had these guys done? They'd walked with him for years. What did they do to earn a rebuke that sharp? Well, the answer reveals a trap that, honestly, is just as easy to fall into today as it was 2,000 years ago. So what was their big mistake? Well, Christ's diagnosis wasn't that they were unintelligent or that they couldn't grasp complex ideas. Nope. The problem was their failure to believe the whole story, the entire counsel of God. They were suffering from a faith that was, you guessed it, imbalanced and lopsided. And this slide just illustrates the core problem so perfectly. See, according to Pink, we all have this tendency to build our own little theological systems, kind of like this puzzle on the left. We want it all to fit nice and neat into our own logic. But then what happens when we come across a piece of God's truth from the Bible that just doesn't fit our puzzle? Well, instead of admitting our puzzle might be too small, we just throw out the piece of truth. And that brings us to a proper definition of what we're talking about: lopsided theology. It's basically cherry-picking the truths you like. We hang on to the parts that make sense to us, the stuff that feels consistent with our logic, and we just kind of ignore or even reject the rest. The result is a faith that's fundamentally out of proportion, and because of that, it's really unstable. Think about it like this, like a beautiful piece of art or architecture. Beauty is all about proportion, right? You could have the most beautiful face, but if one feature, say the nose, grew all out of proportion while the rest stayed the same, it would become monstrous. Pink argues that most theological error isn't about denying truth outright. It's about blowing one truth up so big that it completely overshadows all the others. So, what happens when this kind of thinking plays out in the real world? What are the consequences? Well, you can see them crystal clear, starting with the disciples themselves and stretching all the way into the theological debates we have today. For the disciples, the problem was obvious. The Old Testament talked all about a glorious, triumphant Messiah who would have power and dominion, and they loved that stuff. But it also talked about a suffering Messiah, one who would be humiliated, rejected, and killed. They just couldn't make those two things fit together in their minds. Their own logic became a total roadblock. They were asking, how can a triumphant king also be a despised servant? It didn't compute. And because they couldn't logically harmonize those two ideas, they just tossed out the parts about suffering. They chose to believe only part of what the prophets had spoken. See the problem? And believe me, this exact same failure is what leads to huge divides today. Just think about the split between Arminianism, which puts a heavy focus on human free will, and Hyper-Calvinism, which emphasizes God's sovereignty so much that it can almost erase human responsibility. Each side is clinging to its favorite pillar, and the whole temple of truth cracks right down the middle. And Pink points to other examples too. You have Unitarians who accept the unity of God but completely reject the Trinity. Why? Their logical block is 3 persons cannot be one God. Or you have Universalists who accept God's love and mercy but reject eternal punishment. Their logic says a loving God could never send anyone to suffer forever. In every single case, human reason sets itself up as the judge over what God has revealed. Okay, so if that's the problem, what in the world is the solution? Well, Pink proposes that we have to learn to find balance by holding on to 2 pillars of truth at the same time, even when they seem like a total paradox to our limited minds. And this image right here, this is the way forward. You have pillar 1, God's absolute sovereignty. Man is basically clay in the potter's hands. Then you have pillar 2, human accountability. Man has a mind and a will, and he is commanded to believe. The thing is, we're not supposed to try and logically melt these 2 pillars into one. Our job is to just let them both stand side by side and let them bear the full weight of what the Bible teaches. But you might be thinking, how can I be responsible for something I'm unable to do? It's a fair question. Pink uses this really simple analogy. Imagine a guy buys a bunch of furniture on credit. Then he blows all his money and goes bankrupt.
When the bill collector shows up, the man says, totally truthfully, I am unable to pay. Now, his inability is real, right? But does that erase his responsibility to pay the bill? Of course not.
Pink then applies this idea directly to the Christian life. He says we are responsible to live a sinless life. Now, is any one of us actually capable of doing that? No way. But that inability doesn't get rid of the responsibility. In other words, our ability doesn't define our duty.
So let's bring this home. What does this actually look like in our day-to-day lives? How do we live out a theology that's actually balanced and in proportion? Well, take salvation, for example. Pink breaks it down into 3 causes that work together like gears in a clock. You've got the meritorious cause, that's the blood of Christ, the objective work done for us. Then the effectual cause, that's the regenerating spirit, the work done inside us. And finally, the instrumental cause, the sinner's belief. That's our part, reaching out with an empty hand to take the gift. They're not fighting each other, they're working in perfect harmony.
And this leads to a really crucial point. We can't build our hope on the shifting sand of our own subjective feelings or what we think is happening inside of us. The gospel commands us to look outside of ourselves to the solid rock of what Christ actually did for us on the cross. We're saved by trusting the work of Christ that happened for us. You know, this balanced view just completely demolishes the fatalist lie. The lie that says, hey, if I'm elect, I'll be saved no matter what, so I'll just sit here and wait. The truth is that God ordains the means just as much as he ordains the ends. He could make crops grow without a farmer, sure, but he chooses to use plowing and sowing. In the same way, he chose to save people through the means of them believing and acting. And all of this leads to Pink's incredibly urgent and pretty famous conclusion: evangelize or fossilize. He argued that a church that stops preaching the gospel to everyone, everywhere, will just wither up and die. The church's job is to preach, and the sinner's job is to believe, to reach out like a drowning man grabbing for a rope. It's a call to action, not to passive waiting. So we'll end by turning that question back to you. We've walked through Pink's architecture of truth, and we've seen the very real danger of a lopsided faith. So take a second and think about it. In your own understanding, what are the 2 truths, the 2 pillars, that you find the hardest to let stand together? What parts of the whole story are you, maybe without even realizing it, trying to balance?